Good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Jen Pufke. I'm head of partnerships at LGIU, and I am delighted to welcome you to our joint LGIU and Commercial Services Group discussion on decarbonization in practice, where we're really excited to be exploring energy transition and cost control across local government. Before we get into today's panel, I wanted to take a minute just to run through a little bit of what LGIU membership sort of means in practice and the support that is available to everyone at an LGIU council. Because at LGIU, we have a big vision, one of thriving communities led locally by empowered, democratically mandated councils, which we translate into LGIU membership in really practical ways. There's the insight and the intelligence that cuts through the noise and brings you up to speed on what matters through written resources, through the daily news update you receive every morning at 6 a.m., through our training program, through the shared learning and the chances to connect across the LGIU network. Like our session today, I'm told we have colleagues all the way from Cornwall to the Shetland Islands on the call this morning. So please give us a shout and a hello. Let us know where you're dialing in from this morning. We also have a huge library of case studies, interviews, and best practice examples that are designed just for you. And then there's our research capacity, which we're going to cover off a bit of today, and the partnerships with our LGIU councils. And that's very much about co-creating solutions together to the biggest challenges that the sector is facing, like local government finance, like sustainable locally led services. And of course, last but certainly not least, there's our advocacy work with and for the sector that continues to have real impact across national governments. And we've been providing that unbroken support to councils for more than 4 decades, and that's the level. That's a real esteemed level of accumulated sector knowledge, and our partnership ethos. Those are the two things that really set us apart, and loops directly into those services that we provide to our councils. It's a really unique membership that's evolving alongside you and the challenges that you are facing. So if this is your first introduction to LGIU, or you only know us from those daily morning updates, the 6 a.m. pings into your inbox, I hope you'll explore us further. So enough from me. We're here this morning to talk about how councils are navigating energy transition and the constraints they face, why delivering is slowing, and what is needed to support a more realistic and resilient energy transition. Now, this discussion is informed by LGIU research that we've conducted with the team at Commercial Services Group and draws directly on insights from local authorities across England and Wales. And we've engaged elected members as well as officers in this research with portfolios relating to climate, environment, and energy. I'm really delighted to be joined by the incredible knowledge of the lineup of speakers and experts we have today. First, we'll hear from John Gleek, who's LGIU's head of research and policy, and he'll be sort of getting into the nitty-gritty of the findings. We'll then be joined by Cassidy Travis, who's head of climate and sustainability at the London Borough of Lambeth, and then Eamon Grimes, managing director of energy and carbon at Laser, part of the Commercial Services Group, and they'll both be sort of sharing their reflections on their reflections on the findings from today. So before we get into it, just some housekeeping. We'll record the session and the presentation element of the session, but we'll stop the recording for the Q&A. So do prep your questions for our panelists and be ready to share them in the chat or by raising your hand after those presentations and reflections are done. And after the event, you'll receive a recording, link to the report, and any and all sort of resources that have been mentioned throughout the discussion in your resource pack, which will be sent to your inbox afterwards. So enough for me. Let's get the discussion started. And I'm going to hand it over to John Gleek, head of research and policy at LGIU, who's going to kick us off. John, over to you.
Thank you, Jen. Really helpful introduction. Just bear with me 1 second while I share my slides for this morning. Can everybody see that? Everyone good? Okay, so fantastic. Great to join you all on the call today to talk about this. It's fantastic, the research that we've done. I will talk for probably about 10 minutes and as I say, we'll open up into sort of the wider discussion. This is specifically drawn from research that we have done this year on energy transition in local government. the research was done in partnership with the Commercial Services Group and framed around kind of three big sort of topic areas. So the policy environment of energy transition, the political dynamics, the practical constraints and opportunities, and also diving into a case study on solar opportunities. Um, so we did this working with colleagues from Commercial Services Group earlier this year. We did this really qualitatively with a whole series, a really significant series of focus groups that we ran um, with both cabinet members for environment, climate, or whatever the equivalent role is, and also pretty much exactly the same number of officers with either strategic roles or portfolios relevant to climate, energy, and environment. We did this across England and Wales, and we had a really great spread of representation of different council types, different political control, and different regions of the two countries. So it's great to see yeah, the sort of synergies that come across from all of those. The report is also available now on the LGIU website. It's also published through Commercial Services Group website as well. We will also share the full report as a PDF and these slides in the resource pack that comes out following this session. So I'll talk to you about four things. As I say, it was really in-depth research. I can't unfortunately cover every single aspect of that just now, but I'll talk to you about four things now. One is about how we and what we've learned about communication, about the energy transition. What has also come up through those focus groups about where councils see the energies for decarbonisation and energy transition, and also what some of the constraints on that local delivery is against those opportunities, and then also dive into that particular kind of case study discussion on solar and where that fits with council's plans. So the first point, and this came out loud and clear through all our conversations, is around language and communication. So everyone across every single session really emphasised that energy transition itself remains a really strategic priority. However, how this is communicated both internally and externally is really significantly changing and shifting. So throughout the research, people identified that there is a real shift away from the phrases net zero and climate emergency. Some administrations are really focused on that more about kind of nature protection, greener and greener efforts. However, the really dominant narrative was actually really focusing on, for any of these sort of projects and programs, was on about really tangible sort of socio-economic benefits, lower energy bills, warmer homes, improved health outcomes, and the sort of co-benefits that happen for both public administration and for people and communities. That emphasis on co-benefits also is related internally as well. Well, councils are developing projects and how they're describing them, how specialists are describing them internally within councils and with your partners. So what I've got throughout this presentation is some key quotes that came out of the focus groups. I won't kind of read them all out, but I'll just kind of dip in and out of what people have said. So yeah, what's come out really strongly is this kind of interest in not wanting to specifically focus in on climate emergency or sort of net zero technology, but emergency, but yeah, people are more interested in reframing it around that sort of cost of living. That was actually described across the board. As I say, this was a representative sample, or it was a broad sample, I should say, across different types of council in different parts of the country. But yeah, overall, there was this really whether it's for sort of a change in political balance or the sort of dynamic within the council or with communities, that overall shift was really clear. So yeah, the way in which that was described internally is really important too. So there may be councils may want to continue to use some of that net zero language internally, but actually that framing around sort of co-benefits, financial returns is just as important internally as councils are describing it to communities. So, secondly, obviously, throughout all these discussions, all the different councils that attended these sessions really talked about the opportunities that they see through their work, and these kind of came up automatically, really. So yeah, there's particular kinds of programs that councils see as particularly useful, particularly opportune, and that's relevant across a range of different roles. So I'll talk about that in a second. But what's also really interestingly is that sort of the changes to some structures and organizational shifts and things like devolution are also presenting opportunities in their own right. So the way in which councils are constructed also creates some opportunities. So the kinds of opportunities that came up throughout the research were things like, and this is in no particular order, things like electrification of fleet, especially waste fleets, heat networks, the retrofitting of estates, particularly like literally the council estate and the council buildings, retrofitting of estates working with partner organisations, in particular working with schools. And then say that what came up throughout the discussion was rooftop solar and ground solar. I won't go through all these opportunities, but I will later in this presentation talk to you in particular around where solar fits in some of these council agendas. There's also some sort of opportunities through different sort of delivery models, so through PPAs, tenants tariffs, and sort of partnerships. And with this, this quote from a London borough talking about this was their, particular sort of vehicle for through a strategic energy partnership for sort of developing a lot of this work. So yeah, there's particular delivery models out there that are particularly supporting those programs. What I think is really interesting, and this is particularly interesting given we've got such a range of types of council and places across the country represented here. What came across quite strongly was that the sort of the way in which councils are constituted is also helping to drive some of this work. So, particularly interesting quote from a council that's been through local government reorganisation to become a unitary authority, that process itself was useful to address the climate emergency and actually bringing together of integrating different sorts of services and teams itself was useful to create these sorts of programs of work. Another quote here from someone working for a city council in a devolution context, so scale and working at a regional level with your kind of regional authorities is also really important when developing significant schemes and wanting to get sort of kind of greatest value and impact. So I'll talk about the solar bit as a specific piece, but as I say, there's a whole range of different opportunities that came out of this group. Now, inevitably, when you start talking about programs of work that councils are delivering, people will talk about some of the things that are difficult, challenging, or are kind of constraining the work that we do. So there's a range of internal constraints and a range of external constraints. So internally, colleagues who from our research talked about capacity, the expertise, and where this sits in their organisations, in their councils, the way in which programs and projects are sort of developed and delivered. So yeah, some of those internal constraints. However, the most significant one that came out time and time again, and potentially that's sort of inevitable really, is funding and how these projects are funded and the sort of way the business case sort of develops for them. Now, externally, people talked around the way that the planning system works, the infrastructure that exists, particularly around kind of grid connections, and then the sort of the population, the community side of it. So where the community views are, heritage buildings and heritage schemes, and then political policy shifts. And then, although I say there is opportunities through working at scale, there are some big structural disruptions around kind of devolution and reorganization that are kind of really constraining particular programs. And overall, these constraints mean that while there's really significant progress on a whole range of different schemes and programs, that some of the overall ambitions, some of the big policy ambitions that councils have around sort of long-term goals may not be met, and that did come out through the work. So again, I will just dive into sort of some of the quotes that came out. So some of this may be around in-house expertise, capacity, and capability. So how these programs are described internally, so the jargon or the really actually quite specialist or specialized knowledge and skills that particularly sustainability teams or sustainability officers or energy teams, that kind of thing, will have, can struggle to be kind of articulated internally. And also, it's quite specialist. So, council said that they don't have the capacity, resources, or knowledge to be able to do all those, be able to do all the things that they'd want to be able to do. as I say, like the cash, the funding is really significant. So to be able to get some schemes off the ground, councils have reflected they just don't have the funding. Despite there are really viable business cases, um, some of the funding that they would want to be able to get that off the ground with just isn't there. We did this research earlier in the year. The energy market has only got more volatile since then, and so that sort of market uncertainty is makes business cases more complex to articulate and makes the business cases themselves at times less viable. Some of the place-based stuff, so infrastructure grid connections came up quite a lot in the conversations around the schemes are really viable, and the spaces and places are available to develop particular schemes. However, there's just simply not the infrastructure in place um, to be able to deliver that. Where that could be around connection fees, connections to the grid, or sort of transformers too. Um, Local views is of course important around aesthetics, heritage buildings, and including one officer who described that their own building that they work in was a grade 2 listed building, and that is when they're developing sort of schemes for for example retrofit of the council's own estate, that becomes really significant. And there was detailed conversations around that around both local views, aesthetics, and what that means in terms of heritage places. This was done early in the year, as I say, so this was before the elections. But you can see both officers and cabinet members with these roles, and this again was across the board, different types of political makeup, were thinking about to what extent political change would impact schemes, development, and opportunities. That could be around the technical skills and know-how around the programs, could be around the interest or engagement for these about what this work, and also just the sort of the decision-making process. As I say, some programs are complex to get off the ground, so you want to make sure that councillors and the decision-making process is supported to get that going. For areas that are going through reorganisation, that is a disruptor across a whole range of different policy agendas. Similarly, devolution does actually create some really interesting opportunities at scale, but it again, there's some concerns around sort of bureaucracy process and sort of some of the ambiguity of the relationships between the council and a mayoral authority. What this means, therefore, is that some councils, in fact, I think this was consistent across the board, were talking about previously having sort of 2030 targets in particular, and that is now a sort of changing picture. So the original targets set around 2030 were not realistic, although the ambition is still very much there. So I will just finish this off talking about what came out around solar from our research. So solar was still seen as one of the most crucial opportunities and areas for where development will be most viable. It's definitely not seen as a silver bullet for energy transition. However, it was seen as a really big ticket opportunity throughout the research. That was down to sort of two things. One is the viability of that financial business case, and one is around the sort of practical viability of the schemes themselves when compared to other opportunities. There was sort of quite a sort of good consensus that rooftop solar is definitely a sort of really the most viable option. It's also, so long as it is practically possible around sort of buildings and heritage factors, and ground solar remains particularly contested, although still areas do see that as an opportunity. So just to very quickly sort of dive into what people said. From some places, this is the most significant thing that they can do, and it is, still plays a massive part of the work that they're doing. But for others, it's part of a sort of a mixed portfolio, and it's never going to be a full solution, but it's one of the most sort of crucial things that they have. This is really down to sort of the financial business case. Like there are some more clearer financial returns on PVs than other schemes, particularly when focused on sort of rooftop solar, and that rooftop solar is more sort of positively and sort of favorably considered. Um, and even when, so across different political boundaries. So even areas that would be less, where the administration is less keen on sort of wider net zero policies and politics, actually there is a business case around sort of around solar panels and rooftop solar, so that that still remains solid in that place. Solar farms and ground solar still remains more contested, particularly for communities and the planning system. I guess I touched upon this in the section on constraints. There's still issues around infrastructure, grid, and batteries that can make a difference in that can make a real difference in terms of the availability of different schemes. Uh, some places think that if your roof is not fit for pigeons, then it's particularly difficult for solar panels. But I guess the crucial point is that there are still some practical spatial constraints around the types of buildings and also probably the upfront funding in some places. Um, I guess the more urban places, actually, rooftop solar is the kind of the biggest ticket item. That's probably down to just the spaces that are available in their borough or their city. So I guess I've covered a lot there, and we will, as I say, we'll circulate the full report for you to get your teeth into following this session. So just in a sort of a short summary of that, there's really significant ambition across the board for energy transition for local government. And that is still remain there despite a whole range of kind of changing winds financially, politically, and otherwise. So, but the framing and the operating environment for all of that has really shifted over time. So, a lot of the external communication is now really focusing on the socio-economic benefits and the co-benefits of what these schemes are, rather than a sort of focus on sort of net zero and climate emergency terminology. More and more so, that kind of transition delivery is influenced by the financial business case of particular schemes, more so than the sort of the wider sort of big P or small p sort of political or environmental ambition. And the practicability of schemes is also really important when developing those sort of business cases and getting them off the ground. A whole range of different opportunities really exist across kind of fleet, heat networks, retrofitting, and sort of structural shifts of local government. And when we dove into sort of solar in particular, there still remains a really central strategy for a lot of councils for their estate and also across their wider place, particularly around sort of rooftop. But there's still though there are still infrastructure and viability constraints. Appreciate I packed a lot into that, but hopefully that is more than enough to get the conversation going. And I'll hand back to Jen just to kick
Brilliant.
the conversation off.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, John, for that quick fire overview of this extensive research. Just to reiterate, this was across England and Wales. So I know we have colleagues from sort of Scotland and Ireland on the call as well. So really keen once we get into discussion to get a sense of sort of how does that chime with what you're experiencing on the ground in other parts of the UK and wider. But I am going to hand it directly over to Cassidy Travis, our next speaker. She is Head of Climate Change and Sustainability at the London Borough of Lambeth. And without further ado, Cassidy, keen to get your thoughts on how that lands with you and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jen and John, for presenting that so succinctly. So I was asked to give a little bit of reflections from the research, specifically kind of what I related to, what surprised me, some of the challenges that were uncovered, and also some of the solutions. So I participated in the research, and I think one of the first things to say that as an officer, I think it was quite a cathartic process as well. And one of the things that I related to in particular was just like as we're all kind of discussing some of the challenges and experiences that we've gone through, it's like pretty much what everyone was saying. It was like, yes, 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 I've experienced that. And it really kind of underscores, I guess, the opportunity for us to come together at different scales. And as officers, more often, I think there is a real propensity to kind of put your head down and just try to get on with the role and the job. And there is a real job in trying to communicate and engage just within your own respective council that often we don't put put our head above the parapet enough. So I guess for, first and foremost, just to say it's really important to have spaces and research like this that helps point to the fact that there are so many consistent challenges across our different boroughs. And at the outset, John set out some of the kind of key categories that came out, and I mean, all of those again really are evident within Lambeth. I think the language piece is quite interesting because I've been in a lot of forums where we've had conversations that we need to shift from talking about uh, sustainability, climate emergency, net zero, and it feels like I'm hearing that quite a bit in a lot of different forums. And while I agree with that, I think we also have to be quite mindful of what we mean when we're saying we're shifting to the co-benefit. So we've done a piece of work recently looking at, we were planning on developing a retrofit strategy within Lambeth. And one of the pieces of feedback that we got was that no one knows what this is other than it's expensive and really painful to do. And so that it did, on the one hand, point to the need to really kind of unpack what it means for residents. But I think there's also a crucial piece of like, what are we actually talking about here? And how do we make sure that internally, if you're talking to somebody who's more technical that has a program, that they really understand what are the measures here? How does it impact your program? And I think we do need to do a much better job of selling the benefits and the why rather than leading with the technical jargon. But I also think we have to be quite honest about some of the challenges that we're experiencing. Because if you go in and say, and we've seen this through the evolution of some of our public sector decarbonization scheme programs, this is going to reduce bills, it's going to do all of these things. And the reality doesn't marry up with the expectations that are sold at the outset, then you have a problem there. And one of the things that John pointed to in his research as well is that there are a number of real constraints and challenges, some that might be what I like to call our own goal challenges, where we have processes that aren't really fit for purpose that we need to look at. But then there's other really big system challenges, the energy spark gap, the inability to get grid connections. One I didn't think was mentioned, but just lack of supply chain maturity and people to have a really good understanding of the technology, how to run it, how to manage it. All of those things compound and overlay with program delivery. And so I think kind of throughout the process that we're going through, we need to be clear about the why and what we're doing, but also what are the real risks and challenges and how do we mitigate those along the way. And for me, the kind of subsequent phases of the PSDS program have been a real learning journey in communication and engagement, where at the outset in the first PSDS program where we did solar PV and heat pumps, and you had loads of schools that were interested in signing up. By the third round, I was dragging schools along into the process. And I think, the reputational challenges and experiences of the first phase didn't marry then up with what we were saying. Look, this is a great opportunity. There's good investment, because there were some real delivery challenges that can have knock-on impacts for how people receive this agenda. Um, so I think that's one thing to be really mindful of for many people, and I think it was mentioned. I mean, we're not going through the same scale of uh, changes in devolution and governance structures that some colleagues outside of London are, but we've just had a pretty significant transition as well within our leadership. Is that we're quite trying to be a bit more thoughtful about what we've learned over the course of this journey in our communication. So many boroughs might be, and local authorities might be looking at setting new targets. And I think there was an outset at the beginning where there was very bold, ambitious target set, which is, absolutely the direction of travel of what we want to be looking at. But also being really clear about what are our local levers and what are the right partnerships to develop at scale. So I think there's probably quite a few local authorities as well that are looking at things like local area energy planning. We're partaking in that second phase process at the moment. And I think the opportunity to look at partnership approaches from the outset, how we bring our collective resources together, a really honest conversation about what's within our gift to try and improve processes, internal procurement processes, the kind of resources that you plan for at the outset of a project, the way that you communicate and engage with the end user, who benefits, who pays, where do financial flows, particularly important from a solar PV perspective. All of those things we will be taking forward into new programming, but there does remain some of these system challenges that we need to be cognizant of and probably have, to the extent we can, risk mitigation strategies in place. We have really fragile construction industry. I've been on multiple projects where our contractors have gone into administration. It's not really it's a significant risk that needs to be planned for. The energy spark gap that was mentioned, like what does this actually mean for bills, and what's the direction of travel with the cost of electricity and gas. So I think some of those things is just really being clear from the outset about where you can influence at what scale, and when you can't influence at that scale, who are the right people in the room to be working together. And then I guess the other solution to end on, I guess maybe more of a positive note, is also just thinking about, whilst the financial situation has been challenging, in a way, I think it has forced us to be sharper about business cases and forced us to really focus on where do you direct your limited resources. So we were doing a lot of the PSDS programs. We were focusing a lot on on some of our own buildings within our own stock. There was heavy capital outlay from the council side, and we're now moving into a phase where we're trying to look at a sub-regional level and looking at partnership opportunities that come at scale. And this kind of brings to the point that John mentioned is, heat networks. We've got heat network legislation coming in. The scale at which you can look at some of these decarbonization opportunities are huge. And then within our own stock, we are increasingly looking at opportunities for solar PV with energy volatility. There's a huge opportunity to have either looking at kind of own solar and reducing some of those bills that we're seeing, but also bringing PPAs in. Certainly internally, there's a much greater reception for that, just for the pure kind of stability and predictability of what energy prices can be, which maybe previous people were a bit unsure about that. So, I mean, for me, I guess the sum of the parts of this research has been, hugely important to come together across local authorities at different scales and share these lessons learned, because many of us are going through it. It can be really cathartic. It's an incredibly challenging landscape, and we've got to be honest about that, both when we're trying to have those external and internal conversations and what that means for our engagement. But that doesn't mean that doesn't enable us to look at new opportunities that are coming forward. I mean, one of the mantras that we're having is crisis often breeds innovation. So, while there is massive disruption happening across the sector and within industry and the space that we're all operating in, it also means it gives us an opportunity to really think about where we focus our energy and how we do that. So yeah, I'll stop there. But those my initial reactions to the
Brilliant.
research.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Cassidy. There's so much there. So many really good quotes that own goal challenges. I really like that as well. And I think I was really struck, I think across the piece, kind of the importance of relationships through this change, not just within the council or through contractors and external organizations, but also cross council, and that sort of piece around supporting each other through this time of change, I think is really pivotal, isn't it? Brilliant. Thanks so much, Cassidy. Again, a reminder to attendees just to get your questions ready, either in the chat or by raising your hands. But before we get into that, we are going to hear from Eamon Grimes, who is Managing Director of Energy and Carbon at Laser, which is part of the Commercial Services Group, our esteemed partners in this research. So, Eamon, I'm going to hand over to you for your reflections.
Thank you very much, Jen. I guess there's a little bit of context for those that might not know who we are and what we do. Laser traditionally is a buying group for energy, and we work very closely with the local authority market for the last 30 odd years. But particularly in the last 10 years, we've shifted very much to how we support those net zero kind of programs and initiatives. Similar to Cassidy, I think when we first digested the research, there was a lot of a reassurance, like, yeah, that's exactly what we've been hearing and talking to customers about in the last particular 5 years. I might just pick up I think one of Cassie's final points was about that crisis drives innovation. And interestingly, I was talking to a colleague this week about for local authorities, if you go back, say, a decade, and when the climate emergency declarations first came in, that there has been like an unprecedented period of driving a lot of focus and activity. And I think whilst, particularly because of my background, I'll probably reflect more on the energy system transition piece in a minute. I did think it was interesting to pick up the whole kind of theme of communication, language, how that's progressing. And things like net zero, sustainability, climate change, and it's becoming more about potentially saving cost, energy security. I think that the research been qualitative was actually really interesting. I think we've done a lot of surveys, polls, how confident are you feeling in this or that over the years, but actually getting some of that detail probably gives a bit more of the rationale and the why and the story behind it. One, I think we've already covered about, moving to co-benefits and strap lines like lower energy bills, warmer homes, etc. There was one really interesting extract, which was because of it's less likely to be attacked for scientific or political angles. And I think as a reflection for me personally, that really highlights the power of the modern era of media, PR, social media. Something I'm terrified from a personal level because my daughter's just turned 10 and I'm thinking about social media, etc. But I guess if you were to try and spin a positive on all that, I think what it does highlight from the research is you can reframe things and get, buy-in from various kind of political ideologies and parties if it's reframed on the right things. But I agree with Cassidy's point that isn't at the expense of fact, or there are challenges involved, but maybe there is one positive we can take from that, which is rallying behind, use the language and the reframing that works for your internal organisation, that works for your residents, and that might help with progress. So I think one of the bits, and this is probably more kind of close to our wheelhouse of what we do here at Laser. So the energy system and that broader transition, there was definitely a thing coming out of the research which kind of touched on there is an awareness of there is big change happening or coming, but maybe a bit of uncertainty or lack of clarity of what that actually means for the future. How does that weave into your strategy as an organisation, your project planning, maybe even down to how you calculate forecasts to help with business cases, etc. So I think from our experience there, over the past decade, we haven't always seen a very strong link between potentially how you're buying energy or you're managing energy strategy versus these, from the back of the climate kind of emergency declarations, a net zero strategy. And over time, they are beginning to converge, but they're both critical tools for increasingly critical tools for managing the cost and the operations of an estate as well. So I think that's really important that they do become aligned. I've got a lot of sympathy for that point about we know there's a big change coming. You might not know what that is for a couple of reasons. I think one, specifically for the local government kind of market, you've got quite a few strong push and pull factors that are happening or have happened. So if you look at the last 4 years, we've seen obviously market shocks with geopolitical events. So that's really highlighted the UK's vulnerability to the reliance on whether it's pipeline gas or imported LNG, and means financially we're kind of quite exposed. I think that's really highlighted that. At the same time, you've had obviously with when Labour came into government, launching Clean Power 2030, more recently the local power plan. So these very long-term focused policies, kind of talking about how, to fix that challenge of being vulnerable, we need to rethink how we move to a clean power system. And there's a lot of investment and things that need to happen. And then I think Cassie touched on this, what came out of the research, but to layer on another complexity for local government, LGR is coming. So we've got a lot of regions that are going to go through that. So you have this kind of catch-22 of things that we know need to happen long term, but short term there are going to be constraints. And I think LGR, unfortunately, as we're already picking up from customer feedback, some areas it might lead to indecision. So do we slow down or pause on a few things? We don't want to make commitments that go 5 years into the future for the new authority, etc. But all those bits, if you bring it down to the energy system, I think the bit that's lacking is that clarity of where's this going. And I think that is, even in itself, that's a challenge. If you looked at I guess, an insider viewpoint, experts in the industry, and you could probably get a room full of them and they'd all come up with different answers in terms of what might happen in the next 10 years or so. So it's a bit of a Pandora's box. Some things, like even just the mechanics of the energy market, the government did a consultation on, is it whole system or is it locational? And that would have made a material impact for different regions of the country. You mentioned there's some kind of people from Scotland that have joined, and that might have been very different for business cases or what it means for their pricing locally. But that kind of concluded, no, we're not doing locational pricing. And then more recently, because of the second conflict in 4 years in Iran, we've seen a consultation launch for marginal pricing. So why are we behest to the most expensive generation source at one point in time, which is often gas, because we can't obviously at this point in time use renewables 24 hours a day. And I think, and that is likely a knee-jerk reaction to that recent kind of conflict. So, uncertainty in some energy market prices, a general theme of non-commodity costs, so paying for infrastructure, paying for networks, transmission going up, challenges of connections. It's easy to see how that must be very, very kind of complex to digest that and then think about, for a local authority, what does that mean for my strategy? What does it mean for local, regional kind of net zero plans or renewables, whatever it needs to be. So what can be done about that? And there is no silver bullet. I think if there was, we'd get a very clear direction, single policy, and we'd be getting on and doing it. I think clarity is important, and I definitely spoke to some kind of experts in the industry who kind of have this view of there's no perfect answer. So pick a lane and stick to it. Let's get clarity and a long-term view about what we're doing and how, and then the sector can understand what that means for energy markets, for investments, etc. I think that's definitely one that we will hope to see over time. I think regardless of all scenarios, and this came out in terms of solar, particularly low-hanging fruit, but taking an element of control and with self-generation is kind of seems to be a recurring theme that it means you're less susceptible to market events. Obviously, the finance, the paybacks for those projects need to stack up, but whether it's rooftop solar, whether it's larger scale renewables, and you can work out how you can sleeve that into your portfolio or support kind of local generation, it is the best option. And that's definitely one takeaway that it cuts through all the messaging about why you're doing it. I think the price shocks we've seen very, very strongly cover that financial economic angle, and then it becomes the language bit. How do you relate that to the stakeholders you need to engage with to make that happen? That broader knowledge gap, though, which I think was the bit that came out of the research, in terms of there's just that we know there's something, we don't know what it looks like and why. By pure coincidence, a number of months ago, in conversations with an organisation called Adept, they mentioned they were recognised that was a gap, and they're kind of scoping out some whole energy system training aimed at kind of place kind of directors or planning, economy, etc. So I think that will help. So when that is available, I'm sure that can be shared. But that will certainly help that senior stakeholder at the local authority level, maybe through to cabinet, just trying to understand what is coming and why, and therefore why it needs to be a critical part of broader strategy for the council. I think there's a couple of bits there that linked to solar specifically, which we've touched on. Large scale being challenges like connections and planning, but I think rooftop solar definitely stood out as it was appealing across all kind of political ideologies or parties, etc. So, and I think from our experience, if I looked at probably particularly the last 12 to 24 months, we have seen a flurry of activity there. Now, this might be the kind of final dregs of one of the funding rounds that's happened, but actually is probably more indicative of the paybacks are strong. There's always a challenge of how you find the money, but actually, it's with an outlook of prices aren't going down. Now's the time to really kind of crack on with those. And I think probably an area to, a point to finish on is the finance side. So that's not a huge surprise in terms of broader state of the economy, a long period of austerity in local government. So budget challenges, constraints are always going to be there. But I think and it's interesting, I think Cassidy probably referenced PSDS 5 times in her summary, which probably tells you a lot. We hear so much about how many of our customers over the last 5 years particularly have been accessing various, PSDS, SALIX, low carbon skills fund schemes to help kind of drive activity and innovation. So we know there's a big investment gap to make these things happen. But as things stand, the government have pulled all those schemes. So whilst we're seeing some authorities that still do projects off the back of the last round, there is a little bit of a void there in terms of what next. And that can stifle the market. And I recall a conversation many years ago with an EV charge point operator, I think to do with the Levi funding, and there was a kind of announcement of this is coming, and then a long period of time before the mechanics of how and what was coming, and they spoke about actually for them investing in the grids, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of upfront costs, and it was a real kind of challenging waiting period, and a few of those organisations actually went under during that kind of 18 months or so. Once it was there, great, some fantastic programs, rollouts that are happening. So I think we are seeing, I think, whilst we've got the void of what the funding kind of streams might be, I think the government is making some positive noises. There are high level ambitions. We're seeing, obviously, Great British Energy as their vehicle for a lot of that happening, and they're probably, local power plants, one example about policy level what they're trying to do, and we just need that detail. I think process is key, reflecting on that, and I think from many conversations over the years with our local authority customers, whilst it's a positive funding stream to access, something like PSDS, probably some of the bidding process were a bit arduous, a bit admin heavy, a bit complex. The first round or two were the quickest response one, and that was a little bit of a rat race. So that might be something to reflect on in terms of how is that kind of funding released into the market. By its nature as well, it's probably worth pointing out that those organisations who have more maturity in terms of net zero plans or looking at programs of work are likely going to have more experience and resource to get involved and bid on them. Whereas the regions or the councils that don't have that probably have more low-hanging fruit. So again, bidding processes maybe leave a couple of blind spots in the market because the places that might have the best paybacks or the easiest stuff to do could be getting missed. I think that's probably one consideration of takeaway is how government do that. And we've probably got one example that we've seen in recent years from a government department, which was a little bit different. So in education, the DfE back in late 23 effectively just did a release by school level of grant funding and just said, here's a pot of money, which is ring fenced for buildings or decarb works. It wasn't enough to necessarily fulfill and complete whole jobs, but it helped jobs, and we found for a lot of schools that we also work with, it made finances work and jobs kind of got off the ground and work. So they need guardrails in terms of they had advice on what they could use it on and kind of compliant routes such as ourselves to use it. But it might be one example about maybe just finding the best vehicle for getting the grant funding out there, or helping incentivize projects happening. Is possibly an answer as opposed to complex bidding processes. But yeah, I really good bit of research. I found the qualitative side really helpful. Definitely a lot of themes and takeaways that we're looking at that will help us inform how we kind of understand challenges for our customers and work with them. But just to share a couple of reflections there.
I think I'll just close by saying thank you to our fantastic panel of speakers, Cassidy, John, and Eamon, and a huge thanks to Commercial Services Group for their support of this research project, and look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your days.